Now, it's always a little bit overwhelming when you've got a lot of information looking back at you, and that's the trouble with photos. So the idea is to simplify shapes as much as you can and really clarify the focal point. Okay, I've already prepped my canvas and I've got this shade of cadmium yellow deep with some burnt sienna and some white mixed in as well. So let's dive in. And I'm going to start off with some cadmium yellow medium. I'm then going to add some burnt sienna, and I'm just going to add viridian green to the corner of the brush just to vary the colour a little bit more, and lay it on up and down brush strokes on one side and also on the other. It's always a good idea to work on different sections at the same time, so you get a unity between the two. At this point, I'm more interested in how fresh and exciting the paint's going on the canvas. The more I look at the scene, the more information I'll take on board. So I might start indicating where there's dark areas. So there's some leaves on this side and underneath the canopy. Just going to use some stronger burnt sienna in this corner. So it's a good idea to have dark areas around the sides that lead you into lighter areas. Right, just going to go down a brush size. As I get into the more complicated areas, I just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about what I'm describing. Now, there's two figures which are going to be my main focus for this scene. So what we'll do, we'll get some cadmium red mixed in with some burnt sienna, just to describe one of the guys. Now, figures are quite complicated, so I'm just going to treat them as just blocks of colour at this stage. One there, and there's another guy next to him. And I'm literally going to use a little bit of dark green with some cadmium yellow to describe their heads. Now, the area of the back is quite highly lit, so I'm going to use lots of yellow with some burnt sienna, and again, just streak some of these warmer colours in the background. So we'll get some legs on that character, and again, a few more smaller brush strokes in describing the features in the foreground. There's some dark and light areas, so we'll just lay in a couple of stronger shades. I'm still using the colours I started with, which are burnt sienna and viridian green and some cadmium yellow, and I'm just doing these very, very blocky brush strokes to describe information. The trouble with fine brushes at this point, you start to define less important areas, so very, very good idea to try and restrain yourself from using those till later on. Now, that's pretty much all I want to do for this stage, so I'll just let this settle down and I'll come back to it once the paint has allowed to dry a little bit more. So now I've let the initial layers of paint dry off a little bit, I can go in with a little bit more definition and detail. So we've got some cadmium yellow medium and some burnt sienna and a tiny bit of white as well. And what we're going to do, we're going to just start cutting into some of these dark shapes. Big canopy here, which I'll describe in one go, hopefully. And there we go. With acrylics, you tend to work dark to light, so it's always a good idea to leave your strongest whites till the end. So I might use a little bit of white here and there, but it's always mixed in with some colour until the very end. So the consistency of the paint is really important at this stage. If you're not using a heavy body paint and using the more free flow formula, you could always add a heavy body enhancer to it to really bulk up the paint. And we'll lay in a few more marks. Again, fairly expressive with the brush strokes, really make every mark count. Now at this point I want to introduce maybe other colours. So I'll get some cerulean blue in with some yellow and the burnt sienna I've been using. And we'll describe a couple of these tabletops. Again, fairly expressive brush strokes, and if you've waited long enough to lay in these smaller brush strokes, you'll see a contrast between the more expressive ones earlier. So quite a bit of information in this little area. Like I say, I don't want to describe everything, but I certainly want to make a point that there's a lot going on. So all of this area is in shadow, and this focal point has a lot more variations of dark and light. As long as I don't go too overboard with using lots of different colours, there'll be a colour harmony to the scene without too much jarring. A bit more white with cadmium yellow, and we'll lighten some of these areas in the background. So again, just a good idea to be quite assertive with paint. And I'm just using these blocky shapes really in describing what's going on. As I said, this is a focal point, so this is where all the action is, and I've got to make this area the area that has got the greatest interest. So more white, large dollars of paint. There we go. There's some fine lines describing doorways. All these lines of diagonals for signposts help to lead you in, so it's important to incorporate some of those. Well, I've got this large area of dark green and burnt sienna fusing together. It's quite a good idea to then establish a lovely, potent area of strong light. And again, a couple more doorways, a few more little marks on this side. Again, I'll go back to my burnt sienna, cadmium yellow, a little bit of viridian green. All of a sudden it adds a bit more life. The thing about acrylics, you tend to work dark to light. So even if you had a very dark base, it will provide more interest when you put the lighter shades over it, okay? I'll just go down another brush size just to describe a little bit more detail in the focal point. Just going to use a little bit of cerulean blue. I don't often clean my brushes out too much because I like the way all these colors interact with each other and just create some interesting blends all by themselves. And there's another figure with a red t-shirt over there and a couple of warmer shades at the back. This is the interesting area, so I want to make sure this is what you're going to focus in on. And I'll just let these layers settle down a little bit more, and I'll come in at the very end with some really fine detail just to sharpen up the scene a little bit more. Okay, so I've got some white and some cadmium yellow, and I'm just going to sharpen up a few of the lines. Just try to generalize as much as you can in describing the information in front of you. Some of these bits, just draw that out a little bit more. I'm actually using some of the base colors to draw out some of the shapes. So if I lay in white around some of the darks, it's going to create this negative painting of drawing shapes out. And you'll notice the marks start to get progressively smaller because I'm defining things. The really good thing about acrylic, they're so versatile. You can water them down, use them like watercolor. You can paint on so many surfaces. You can use them for screen printing. You can use them on MDF, you can paint murals with them. Because they're made from a plastic, they're durable, and apparently they last for 100 years. Quite important to be assertive about these highlights so they really stand out. And again, I'm using these flathead brushes to give me a nice crisp brush stroke. This is a 1/2-inch brush. Your brush should progressively get smaller as you lay in detail. What I will do is just lighten the top of this guy's shoulders. And again, just working my way around the painting, describing bits of information as I go. The added interest is in the thickness of the heavy body paint, because I can go on quite thick in places to add, like I say, this other dramatic element to the scene. And a few more little bits of highlight on the tables using the same colours I've started with, maybe in smaller amounts, a little bit more white. This area is a little bit empty, so we'll just lay in a few shots of colour. There's all this paraphernalia of touristy goods, so again, just breaking up some of the shapes, maybe a couple of darks as well. A few more highlights, breaking up areas and really conveying this sense of sunlight breaking through just as I work my way around. Just softening areas off, just so there's a little bit more variety, and the final mark should always be with the focal point to really make these areas stand out. And there we go. It's just a very, very quick study just to show what you can do with a busy scene and just simplifying things so there's a focal point that you immediately look at and you lose all the other secondary bits of information and you make full use of your sharp detail.